It's nice to have lots of support, but it's even nicer when you've got the people who are actually leaving thoughtful and um, incisive comments that are a critique of what you've done, an honest critique. Um, Even if they feel like the voice in the wilderness, please don't stop doing that, guys, because it's more valuable than I can adequately explain, I think.
I think this is where I come in. About a month ago, I did a debate recap between Sargon of Akkad and Michael Brooks, and it actually was quite popular. However, despite the fact that I said at the outset that I was a huge Sargon fan, it seemed like everyone who posted in the comments took some personal offense to the fact that I wanted to provide some pointers. And so it really amazed me because I watched the most recent debate between Sargon and Kristi Winters, and it seemed like Sargon was making a lot of the same mistakes. And those mistakes were specifically how you control a narrative in a debate with someone who's deliberately being cagey and withholding a lot of their beliefs. And I thought, of course, I've already done a video on this. But then I saw Sargon's appeal to get feedback, and I thought, oh, what the heck? Maybe I can do a follow-up video where I take a few of the concepts I pointed out in the original and sort of highlight them. So that's what I'm going to go for right now. 5 tips that, if followed, could have let Sargon win the debate against Kristi Winters. I've noted to keep this positive because apparently people didn't like the negativity last time. Number 1, control the topic and the narrative. Now, alright, this should be basic, but what does everybody know about the left and social justice warriors generally? They function on creating a narrative and creating a story about how they're the good guys and how everyone who opposes them are ignorant or openly malicious. So the first priority any debater has is to control the central narrative of the debate. That means as they're telling their story, you're telling your story. But here's a second problem in formal debate. In open conversation, the narrative just naturally arises. But in formal debate, the narrative and the back and forth is going to focus on around a central resolution, a central point of disagreement. So before the debate even begins, you have to make sure that you understand what that resolution is. And we have to ask ourselves, what was the resolution for this debate?
The motion is feminism good for the world?
And here we have our first problem. I mean, who picked this resolution? Firstly, it's incredibly broad. It can mean a number of different things. Secondly, it's geared so generally that it'll be very, very easy to point to some time and some place somewhere in the world where feminism was indeed useful. And here's an additional point. The way the resolution is phrased, Sargon actually agrees with it. He has said in numerous videos that he actually thinks that there are some places in the world where feminism is needed and is good. Therefore, the resolution is phrased in a way that it'll be very, very hard for Sargon to bring arguments that are both topical and communicate his main objections against feminism. I mean, okay, we could have taken this resolution and brought in someone like Straughn, who thinks that feminism was universally bad, but Sargon isn't that person. So essentially, he set up with a resolution that he in part agrees with, which is an easy way for an affirmative side to gain points. They have a negative side that does not really come prepared to debate the resolution at hand. And I know what people will say. Sargon came with his own issues to discuss. He probably said yes to a debate and didn't really pay attention to the resolution. But the resolution is important because that means, since the opposition is intending to debate the resolution, every point that she makes will be topical. And even though you might have good points yourself, and they might communicate something that's really, really valuable to understand is a deficiency of feminism, as you bring them up, the moderator is within his right to dismiss them or to divert the conversation because they are not strictly speaking on the topic at hand, which is feminism good for the world? And of course, there's going to be a question and answer session where people can bring up objections, and I think that's where Sargon really thrives. But at the same time, agreeing to a resolution that you in part or totally agree to essentially means that you have ceded the narrative for the opening and the rebuttals over to your opponent. They're going to be talking about topical subjects, and you're going to be bringing up points that are, strictly speaking, not on topic. So that's the first problem. The second problem, understand the Motte and Bailey. Now, okay, I need to explain this a little bit before I go on. The Motte and Bailey doctrine was an analogy basically used to illustrate the act of intentional equivocation. Now, I know Sargon's a fan of medieval history, and so am I, but the Motte essentially is a heavily fortified area, and the Bailey is like a courtyard where you do your business. And so the Motte and Bailey strategy, it's a strategy of equivocation, means that people will lay out arguments that are indefensible, but are productive for them doing their business. So this would be like patriarchy theory, rape culture, microaggressions, any number of the things that feminists use to operatively exert control. And this is the Bailey, right? This is the courtyard where you do your business. However, when challenged, you then switch back to a bunch of alternative definitions that are much more standard and much more defensible. Here you have things like, feminism is the principle that everyone should be equal. Feminism is just saying that men and women should have equal rights. All these things that everyone agrees with, and you'll never, in this state, hear anything about patriarchy or anything about rape culture or any of the other, strictly speaking, useful things they have for exerting control. And this is called the Motte, because it's highly defensible, it's very, very hard to penetrate, and it seems totally unobjectionable. So the Motte and Bailey doctrine is when you're not facing any serious challenge, when you're in a position where you're going to be teaching people, where no one's going to challenge your authority, you lay out things that are the Bailey arguments, the ones that are indefensible but are highly profitable. This is where you have people teach about the privilege theory, the patriarchy theory, the sort of Marxist Hegelian notion of feminism where, it's an oppressive class of men and an underclass of women. All that stuff gets trod out when there's little chance of being challenged. However, when a challenge occurs, then you retreat back to the form of feminism that is very easy to defend, the stuff that emphasizes equal rights and activism. Now, you may have noticed that there are a lot of sloppy feminist thinkers out on the interwebs, and they make a lot of stupid arguments. Probably they don't even conform to their own radical beliefs that they learned from their women's studies professors, right? But one thing that they are very, very good at is avoiding debates when they're advocating for doctrines that are, strictly speaking, the Bailey doctrines, the ones that are very radical and very useful. Just take a quick look on YouTube. See if you can ever find somebody who is in a debate over the feminist principle of the patriarchy. Just the patriarchy. You can't find one, right? There are tons of debates about feminism, but a feminist will never engage in a debate about patriarchy theory. And they'll never even bring it up in a debate, because it's never meant to be debated over. It's only meant to be taught. But there is a certain contrapositive to this. If I'm going to debate a feminist, I'm certain that they will never bring up patriarchy, they will never bring up rape culture, they will never bring up any of the radical notions that you usually hear about in women's studies class. I can be sure of this. I can be sure if the feminist has agreed to a debate in ahead of time, I will never hear these concepts. And I need to be prepared for that fact. I can't go into the debate expecting to have them spew all this radical stuff, even if they have, in previous circumstances, done that. And alright, Sargon, if I can address you directly, if you were looking at a resolution that says something like, is feminism good for the world? Then I think I would be pretty certain at that point that I would be debating someone who would never bring up something as silly as patriarchy theory. It's apparent at that moment that when you're debating this feminist, she's going to be debating a totally unobjectionable principle of equality, and the drawbridge is going to be pulled up and she's going to be firmly ensconced in that moat. And I know, it's super annoying, right? There's nothing more annoying. They'll even pretend like they never have even heard of these concepts. They'll pretend like they've never heard of white privilege. They'll pretend like they've never heard of patriarchy theory. Like, the 1 in 5 rape statistic is just some weird notion that some radical person thought up and it somehow drifted into the president's speech. They'll pretend like they're totally innocent. And you even saw this in the Michael Brooks debate, right? Like, he doesn't know what the New York Times is. He doesn't know what Salon is. He has no knowledge of anything. He doesn't have any knowledge of that. That's who are you talking about, these radical people? So you should be prepared for the fact that there's going to be a certain amount of feigned ignorance. And you can use this to your advantage if you're prepared for it. And I'll go into that a little bit later. All right, tip number 3, anticipate boilerplates. Now, okay, let's say you have found yourself in a debate with a feminist or some other left-wing radical, and you have conceded to a resolution that's very, very conservative and easy for them to defend, and, they're going on their usual narrative. Well, here's one thing you can do. The narrative that's used to defend these things like feminism and communism and various aspects of socialism, they're so predictable. They always have the same number of points, and they can easily be needled. And I'll explain what I mean by this. I mean, when I say needle is, they have factual inconsistencies that can be pointed out so that the narrative is disrupted. It may not be enough to upset the entire argument, but it's enough to give pause and to actually disrupt the narrative and the story they're telling about how these things are universally good or, universally true. An example of this might be, say, a communist who would cite something like the Spanish Revolution or Che Guevara, right? And you just happen to know that Che Guevara, murdered a bunch of peasants when he was a revolutionary. Or you happen to know that the Spanish Revolution communes were, not stable. These would be things that would disrupt the narrative, even, for instance, if you in part agreed with some of the ideas behind them. Say you were a socialist and you thought that these intentional communities were valuable. It's still important to disrupt the narrative by knowing what the boilerplate standard examples are going to be and questioning them. Now, I know this all sounds very, very abstract, but there actually was an instance a few months, I think a year ago, actually, where Karen Straughn, she's excellent at doing just this, disrupting the narrative. She was on the Young Turks. And, of course, she's debating feminism, as usual, whether it's good or not. Actually, a very similar resolution to the one that Sargon was debating in this video. And, of course, as you would predict, Cenk Uygur pretends like, oh, of course, there's radical feminists, but we're all just moderate feminists here. I mean, even though I would say that the Young Turks is about as radical a left-wing institution as you possibly can get, but still, Cenk's playing the moderate card. And Karen's actually able to turn it around. I just want to play a little clip here.
Do you grant that feminists for a long time did great work in getting women rights that they clearly did not have, and that today there might be a strand of radical feminism that you disagree with, and I would be surprised if I didn't disagree with, but that there's a distinction between those two different branches of feminism?
In some ways, yes. In other ways, no. I mean, if you look at even their advocacy right from the very beginning, so this would be even before women suffrage and all of that. And you look at a cultural norm such as sort of default father custody after divorce, which is the way things used to be done. And the reason why they were done that way is because the man had the sole financial responsibility for taking care of the children. And if he was at fault for the marriage breakdown, he would continue to have financial responsibility for taking care of his ex-wife.
Okay, so that goes on for a little bit long, but you can see essentially what Karen does in that clip. Cenk has a narrative. Feminism was golden for the first 80 years, and then maybe some small radicals, come online in something like the 80s or perhaps even the 70s, and we don't know what they are. They're just obscure, right? So Karen questions that narrative by introducing an inconvenient fact, and then what happens? We all know what happens. If you watch the video, Cenk just melts down. He just loses it because it wasn't even that important fact that Karen brought up. She brought up something like custody rights of children in 19th century England. That's so obscure. How could it offend him? Yet it disrupts the narrative. And even if you say, for instance, agreed with that reform, I certainly agree with that reform, unlike Karen, but that small disruption in the narrative just collapses everything, because once the moderate facade cracks, once there's a dent in the moat, it stops becoming a defensible position and it gets the person quite angry. And I mean, it makes sense that this gets some people so furious, especially if they're pulling the sort of Motte and Bailey doctrine thing where they're not actually being honest with their views and they're strategically adopting more moderate views because they already are not saying what they believe and you're not even agreeing with them on that. They get really angry, and it's a great way to dispel dishonest moderate positions. All right, number 4, know your enemy, like the Rage Against the Machine song. No, but really, I mean, it kind of surprises me a lot how little research there is that's done into people, the actual people that are debated online. Like, I can tell from watching the video of Sargon that he spent a long time writing out his introduction and his first rebuttal. It's all canned, right? And it's another stylistic criticism. He probably should have used the rebuttal to actually address her points as opposed to going on a different tangent. But even so, if he had used some of that time instead to actually just look up Kristi Winters, he might have had some huge insights into the strategy she would use, the kind of arguments that she could encounter, and more importantly, radical positions that she might want to distance herself from in a debate that she actually does hold. This would all be available online. For instance, I spent 5 minutes Googling Kristi Winters, and I was able to pull up her Google Scholar page. It has all her research on it. I mean, I can just read down the line and see what she said on various things. Okay, she looks apparently like she does a lot of stuff with political interests, how men and women differ on elections, a lot of statistics here. So you get a good idea that she does have a background in statistics and political behavior, probably where she's going to go for her moderate pivot. The YouTube channel is a better place to go to see what her real activism is. You can do, again, a Google search and find it. Here you get feminist critiques, a lot of stuff about wage gap. You get into the more radical stuff. You look down a bit, you get Anita Sarkeesian here. And here we go, patriarchy. Evidence that patriarchy is the real thing. U.S. rape culture evidences the patriarchy, biblical patriarchy. And I know you're probably asking, well, why are we even looking at this? The resolution isn't about patriarchy. It's about, is feminism good for the world? It's much more general. It's much more moderate than this. Well, the reason why I always think you should look at these sources is you can actually hold her to these opinions. Once they're actually her positions, with her names on them, with her published papers, you can bring them up in a debate, even if it's a moderate debate, and hold her to those opinions. Don't bring up some other feminist opinions. Don't bring up Gloria Steinem. Don't bring up anybody. Don't bring up Salon.com. She can deny them all, but she cannot deny the work that has her name on it. So if you ever need to actually address radical feminism, address the radical feminism and the stuff about patriarchy that she specifically has talked on herself and put her name to. She can't deny it. And this is the same thing with Michael Brooks too. There could have been previous research to actually explore his opinions as opposed to referring him to Reza Aslan's opinions. Or Ben Affleck's opinions. If you were talking about his opinions, he could not deny them. He'd be professionally obligated to actually own up to those opinions. And this is a way that you can actually end the retreat back to the moat. You can actually stop this moderate pivot and discuss the real subject of radical feminism and the radical feminist ideas that these people are teaching. And this brings us to the last point. Number 5, pick the target, freeze it, and destroy it. Now, I took this one from the 12th rule from Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, which I know Sargon likes, and I think he'll appreciate that. But this is a really critical thing to understand. If you have a point that you think you have a very clear path to victory on, you have to try to keep the conversation on that point and get an admission from your opponent. Now, Sargon acted like he really lost the debate. I agree it wasn't the best performance, but he did have a portion that he did a really good job on, and that was in the question and answer period when they were discussing the right way to address problems. And Kristi Winters said that essentially, in order to engage with gender, you have to use a feminist lens. We can take a look at the clip.
For looking at the differences between men and women, if you're looking at gender norms in a society, you're doing feminism.
Oh, yes, please, go ahead.
Feminism isn't a motive, it's not a method, it's an ideology.
No, it's a method.
No, feminism does not have, no it's not, and it does not have the monopoly on saying we're going to analyse gender. And if anyone analyses gender, they're doing feminism. That's nonsense That's massive overreach. It's totally unjustifiable.
Okay, what other theoretical framework allows you to evaluate sex differences and gender differences? Because it's
based
feminism.
scientific discipline. They can choose psychology, they can choose biology, they can choose evolutionary
That's not a
psychology,
theory.
they can choose any discipline they want, but feminism is just one of many. And you're trying to claim this ideological hegemony. It's creepy.
No, because
You think that literally no one can look at an analysis of gender and not be a feminist is mental to me.
Evolutionary. Okay, like evolutionary psychology is looking at the impact of how societies are influenced by having evolutionary outcomes. But that's not doing an analysis of gender norms in a society. If you want to look, again, the fact that you can't come up with an answer.
Analysis itself is feminism, okay.
I mean, Sargon kind of laughs off the last part here, and he lets the conversation go back really to something that resembled more of the resolution. Is feminism good for the world? But, I mean, he should have stuck on this particular point. This not only represented the crux of Kristi Winters' argument that, feminism is just something everybody does, but Kristi Winters also said something that was demonstrably false, namely that evolutionary psychology cannot be used to describe gender differences, which we know from numerous studies that it can. If he had actually gone in for the kill on this subject, he could have made a huge point about how feminism equivocates its actual definition, gotten Kristi Winters to eat her words about this very, very broad definition of feminism, and had the audience question her credibility as someone who is trying to bring the scientific perspective in on a feminist worldview, which is at its base not methodological but ideological. This is really an important fact, especially when you're struggling to keep control of the narrative. When you have a point that's obviously something that's a weakness of your opponent, you have to go in and you have to highlight it. You have to start making that the subject of the debate, at least for an extended period of time, at least for a time that the opponent concedes an argument to you. If you can do that, then you can turn the narrative of the debate around and actually save face in a debate that probably, by the virtue of its resolution, was going to be a little bit of a fiasco anyway. So I guess with those 5 points I've really outlined, I think, the tips that really anybody, but in particular Sargon, could use to win a debate or confront a debate with a feminist or some other person on the left who's trying to control the narrative. So with that, I hope you found this video entertaining and useful. Have a wonderful night.